Oh, we're out live.
It
Hello,
is just
everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. Greg Brooking is our guest. He was just telling me about the print on the wall behind him, which I'm sure some of our viewers may be wondering about. What is it, Greg?
it is just a print that I found at an antique store that just kind of captivated my imagination about days earlier when we were on horseback. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
all it
Wow.
is. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's great. That's great. So, Greg Brooking has a doctorate in history from Georgia State University, but also he's a full-time social studies teacher in North Springs High School in Georgia. And we're actually here to talk about your book on James Wright. Um, from Empire to Revolution, Sir James Wright and the Price of Loyalty in Georgia, a biography of Georgia's governor at the beginning of the American Revolution. Actually, James Wright had been governor for a while before the war started.
Yes, sir.
So, can you tell us a bit about who he was and how he got to Georgia?
Well, he's a really interesting character, stodgy, but his story is interesting. He was born in London. Um, to a father who was um, a pretty successful lawyer. His
Mhm.
grandfather was Sir Robert Wright, who was Chief Justice of the King's
Hmm.
Court, and had the made the unfortunate decision to follow King James II.
Ah,
It ended up dying. The grandfather died in Newgate Prison at the time of the Glorious Revolution.
oh my goodness.
And his father, Robert Wright Jr., was a lawyer and kind of in some ways, in his personal life, a ne'er do well. Uh,
Hmm.
I discovered that James Wright and his siblings were all born to a mistress that Robert Wright married after the death of his first wife. Um,
Hmm.
and shortly after the death of the first wife and the marriage to James Wright's actual mother, the family moved from London to Charleston, South Carolina,
Oh wow.
likely in an attempt to ensure that the children would not have the stain that they otherwise would have, and would also be able to inherit,
Hmm. Hmm.
anything that Robert Wright was able to leave to them. But they came to America in 1725. He was a precocious young man. By the age of 18, he was serving part time as the Attorney General of South Carolina in the absence of the actual Attorney General. He served
Wow.
South Carolina in a number of positions, from Attorney General to colonial agent.
Hmm.
He was a very successful private attorney, but in the mid 1750s, he moved back to London to act as South Carolina's, colonial agent.
Wow.
Their primary lobbyist, if you will, to
Hmm.
Parliament. And he intended on staying there, but fate would have different plans for him.
Let me see. How old was he when the family left London the first time?
He was 9.
Okay.
They moved in 1725,
Okay.
and he was 9.
Okay. So he'd spent actually most of his life then in South Carolina, some not, and
Yes.
then goes back to London, anticipating that that will be his home. That's not unusual to see London as the home base.
Correct, and London as the goal.
Right. Yeah. Certainly more
For a
exciting
lot
than
of
Charlestown.
right, for sure. And he had in the interim, in addition to his legal work, he had started buying properties and um, uh, cultivating them for rice production.
Okay.
He enslaved a good number of
Mhm.
folks before he came to Georgia, but it wasn't
Mhm.
until he came to Georgia that he really expanded his
Mhm.
slavery empire, if you will.
Right. And when does he come to Georgia?
He comes to Georgia after a 3 year stint as colonial agent
Mhm.
that lasted from 1757 to 1760.
Mhm.
He replaced a really popular governor by the name of Henry Ellis, who had complained of the fatigue and the weather and the
Mhm.
climate in
Yeah.
Georgia, hoping to get a temporary relief. And the crown said, "Well, just come on back for good."
Right. Yeah.
And so Wright replaced him
Mhm. Mhm.
in 1760, and stayed, with the exception of 3 years, until 1782.
Wow.
Of course, the Revolutionary War interrupted it
Yeah,
for a couple of
that's right.
years, but
That's
he
right.
came
Yeah.
back. He was
Okay.
the only governor who actually came back. And
Yeah. Yeah. I'm wondering, Greg, what Georgia was like at the time he arrived, and because it was a relatively new colony. I think you're muted for some reason. I'm not hearing you.
can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, Georgia was the youngest of the colonies. In fact, by the time of the Revolutionary War, it was still receiving an annual parliamentary stipend to buttress its existence.
Yeah.
But when he came in 1760, a gentleman by the name of Harold Davis wrote a book called The Fledgling Province, which was what Georgia was kind of considered, in the 1760s. It was just getting off its feet, and most of its growth came after slavery was allowed. For the first 20 years or so, the Georgia trustees forbade slavery. They forbade rum as well, which may have angered Georgians more than the prohibition on slavery. But once slavery was allowed in the 1750s, Georgia started to take off, and Wright played an instrumental role in expanding Georgia's geographic and economic scope in the 60s and 70s.
So I'm interested in why the trustees of Georgia, who they were, and why they forbade slavery as well as rum at the outset.
Right, it's a good question. A lot of folks think that Georgia was founded as a debtor's colony, to act as a buffer zone between Spanish Florida and Charleston, and it was indeed founded as a buffer zone. The most famous trustee was James Oglethorpe, who became kind of governor, military commander of Georgia in its early years. But they forbade slavery and rum because they wanted to populate Georgia with industrious, sober men who could actually perform the task of building a colony and also providing a buffer zone. And it just turned out that it didn't take Georgians long to see the opulence of Charleston and kind of want some of that for themselves.
So he's only like the third of the royal governors, isn't he? So
yes, he's the third of three.
And
of the
Ellis
royal governors
lasted a couple of years.
Ellis was, his two predecessors only lasted a few years each. John Reynolds, who was entirely unfit for a leadership position. Henry Ellis, who was, by all accounts, an excellent leader, but actually sought higher positions than governorship of Georgia. And so Wright replaced him, and Wright's obviously the one that lasted quite a long time, even though he did require some encouragement to stay after several years.
Interesting. Now, in addition to developing rice cultivation that South Carolina had, Georgia also, like South Carolina, had an extensive trade relations with the Cherokee, the Creek, the native people. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about then Georgia's relationship with the native folks in the area.
Yeah, Georgia's going to have follow a similar path to economic development as South Carolina and the Caribbean, but also in terms of their native relations, it'll be intertwined with that of South Carolina. Augusta, Georgia, which will be kind of the second largest town, if you will, behind Savannah, is in northeast Georgia, and it's along the Indian trading path that goes through northwest South Carolina and then down into Charleston. And so that'll be a primary trading post and route for Native Americans with all of Georgia. One of the first things that Wright has to deal with as governor, and it occupies much of his first few years, is Native American relations. And that's one of the things that Henry Ellis, they met briefly before Henry Ellis departed Georgia. And Ellis, impressed upon Wright the need to maintain and buttress Georgia's relationship with the Native Americans, because they so outnumbered British Georgians.
So he is there for the closing years of the 7 Years' War, and then the trouble begins between the other colonies in the mother country. So what's the relationship of Georgia to Britain when Parliament is passing the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and these other pieces of legislation?
Yeah, good question. He is
You're muted again, Greg.
popping up. I'm not sure why. Can you hear me now?
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
We're talking to Greg Brooking, who is the author of a biography of James Wright, From Empire to Revolution, Sir James Wright and the Price of Loyalty in Georgia. And we're just beginning to talk about the 1760s, when trouble is beginning between the other colonies and the mother country, and what's happening in Georgia, which, is, Greg said, is a fledgling colony, still getting a stipend from the crown.
Yes, and so as I said, the first thing he has to deal with is Native American relations at the close of the French and Indian War and Pontiac's rebellion as it kind of seeps its way down into Cherokee country in South Carolina, and thus Georgia is going to have to deal with the ramifications of that. And Wright is bitterly upset about the proclamation line of 1763 following that war, because he rightfully, presciently kind of observed that the colonists are going to be really upset about that. And it's going to bring down to Georgia folks that might have crossed into the Appalachians. And many of those folks, Wright is going to deride as quote unquote crackers, kind of lawless men who are just going to squat on land and kind of do what they will regarding the Native Americans. And it's going to upset the balance of trade, which is then going to upset the Native Americans. So he's already kind of upset with some imperial decisions regarding kind of the beginning of what we kind of conceived the long American Revolution beginning in 1763. So 1764 and 65 roll along, and Wright understands Georgians' disappointment with the Stamp Act. It doesn't affect Georgia as much as it does folks in Massachusetts or New York, but it becomes an issue, and he understands their grievances. He just implores them to express their dissatisfaction in a constitutional way. And Wright is a true 18th century conservative. He is born of the elite class and doesn't understand. His fatal flaw is that he's not going to understand the passions of the era in which he is now governing. And so he is able to, as the only governor in America at the time, the 13 colonies, to successfully distribute stamps, albeit not many and albeit for not long. But he is able to do that. He is able to quell Georgia's Sons of Liberty a decent bit. He calls them the Sons of Licentiousness because he is they are so difficult to deal with. He finds himself his home being shot at. He finds himself confronting rebels on the streets of Savannah as they protest this Stamp Act. And then when the repeal is issued, he is flabbergasted. He's apoplectic. He doesn't know what he was fighting for if they were just going to repeal the act. And he said that was going to create a pattern in America where the colonists understood that Britain was not as strong in their determinations as he had wished. He had said if they had just stuck through it and held firm, the problems would have dissipated and Britain's authority would not be questioned. But as it was, he anticipated a great deal of turmoil in the future. Right.
Because the colonists then see they can pressure the British government and they'll get what they want.
Right. As I tell my high school students, it's like, the child, begging its parents to go out or for a toy and the parents saying no and no. And then all of a sudden the parent says yes and the child learns a lesson.
Right. Yeah. It's a good lesson there that James. By the way, does he have a family? Is he married and have a family in Georgia?
He does. He has several children. He is married. His wife and two of his daughters die at sea on a return voyage to London when the mother is taking the eldest daughter back to London to marry. And they are lost at sea, and there is zero personal correspondence that Wright left. We believe that much of it was lost at the beginning of the Revolution as he's trying to escape. And so we have to kind of piece together. This is a really difficult part of the book, but we had to try to piece together and triangulate other sources.
Really?
But he was as one might imagine, utterly heartbroken.
Oh yeah. Were these his only children?
No, he had a couple of other daughters, and he had some sons. In fact, James Wright Jr. will serve in the military during the war. He has another son, Charles, that joins the actual British 64th Foot, and he has another son that operates in Charleston after the British take over as kind of a counselor of police to kind of help mediate between the British and the rebels.
That he never marries again.
He never marries again. There's an interesting tidbit that I only mention with caution. When he died, he left in his will an annuity and some money to a servant named Jenny, and that's all he says. He doesn't say anything else about her, but for her faithful service to the family. I scoured the records for any other mention of Jenny in any of his correspondence, and the only one Jenny came up, and I don't know if it's the same one or not, but just as an itemization of his enslaved property at one of his 11 plantations.
Now, is she free at the end of when he dies, when he leaves her an annuity?
Yes. Once he passed away, she is going to be taken care of financially and have her own place. So,
interesting.
The assumption there is that she was emancipated.
Really a challenge to write a biography of someone who doesn't leave personal papers, and then you are having to scour lots of sources to piece things together like this.
Yeah, that was the most difficult part. And in fact, probably the dean of colonial Georgia history, a guy by the name of Kenneth Coleman, who taught at the University of Georgia for decades.
You're muted again. I'm sorry, Greg. There we go.
Okay. I'm
not
not sure what's happening.
Now you're back.
Okay, good.
So
Kenneth Coleman was contemplating writing a biography of James Wright in 1957.
Wow.
And he never did. He wrote some journal articles about Wright. A historian by the name of William W. Abbott wrote kind of a collective story of Georgia's 3 governors. A short piece for UNC Press decades and decades ago. But I'm guessing neither did write a biography because of the dearth of personal correspondence. Right. And most of what I get about Wright's personal life, I get from his various loyalist claims at the end of the war, as he details a lot of things. Also, his best friend in Georgia was a guy by the name of James Habersham. And a historian by the name of Frank Lambert wrote a biography of Habersham. And Habersham's papers, they have a decent amount of material about Wright. In fact, Habersham lost his wife about the same time Wright lost his wife in 1764. And Wright moved in with Habersham for a brief period of time as they could kind of console each other.
Interesting. So Wright and his family remain loyal. Habersham remains loyal. And I'm wondering what the breakdown is in Georgia and again, it was one of the ideas the British had, that Georgia would be a loyal place, and it does. Savannah remains in British hands at the end of the war. So what is kind of the political breakdown in Georgia over this period?
It's an interesting breakdown. It is a true civil war in Georgia, and they recognize that very early on. James Habersham's sons did not maintain their loyalty. In fact, it was James Habersham's son, Joseph, they called him Joe Habersham, who arrested Wright at the beginning of the Revolution in January of 1776. So, whereas Wright's sons all remained loyal to the crown. There was a true divide between, further up country or back country Georgians and Savannaians. But even within Savannah, there was a real divide. James Wright always incessantly complained that if the British had just sent him 500 soldiers, he would have never lost Georgia. But of course, that never came.
Interesting. Now, also in the late 1760s, the Carolinas have a regulator movement that's backcountry resistance. Is something like that also happening in Georgia in the late 1760s?
Not as overtly as that, although Wright does mention the regulator movement several times in his correspondence, and he does have to deal with what he considers roving bands of frontiersmen that are threatening to come to Savannah and take his person, even prior to 1776, but nothing as organized, even as the regulator movement was.
Interesting. We're talking with Greg Brooking, author of a biography of Georgia's governor, From Empire to Revolution, Sir James Wright and the Price of Loyalty. And we're talking a bit about Wright, interesting figure, an interesting place. And so as these events in the 17th, as the crisis is really developing between the mother country and the colonies in the early 1770s with the Tea Act, other things that really trigger this response. What's happening in Georgia in the early 1770s?
In the early 1770s, things are happening at a much faster pace than has previously been credited. Wright's correspondence, he goes to England to secure a Native American land cession in 1770. He had already secured one in 1763, but he felt he needed to go back to England to personally talk with the ministers regarding a second Native American cession, which augments Georgia's geographical territory by several million acres.
Who's it a cession from, Greg?
A wide variety. Both of them were a wide variety of Native Americans, but primarily the Creeks, to a lesser extent the Cherokees, but also the five nations of the South. And both sessions were successful in terms of from the British point of view. But while he is in England at this time, we have the Boston Massacre.
Right.
And so he comes. He wants to stay in England, but the king offers him a baronetcy if he'll return to Georgia, and so he becomes Sir James Wright. Which is actually kind of confusing because there was another Sir James Wright who received a baronetcy the same year in England, and he was a Venetian ambassador, and so. Early on researching that, it proved quite confusing. But
did you have to take a research trip to Venice?
If only. he had to, or he came back to Georgia just in time for the Boston Massacre. And that is when things really start to change for Georgia, as it does for everybody in the 13 colonies. You know, the course of intolerable acts that follow that. Britain has had enough. And their response to Massachusetts and Boston, it makes its way down to Georgia, and just with the other colonies, the thought process is if they can do it to them, they can do it to us. But he is still able to. He's a very respected fellow in Georgia. He has a great deal of political capital. He spends a bit of it in his resistance to the Stamp Act protests. He prevents Georgia from sending folks to the Stamp Act Congress. He prevents Georgia from sending delegates to the First Continental Congress after the Intolerable Act. But once fighting starts in Lexington and Concord in the spring of 75, it is a very quick descent for his authority in Georgia. He complains in the summer of 1775 how power has nearly been wrested from his hands by the sons of, as I said earlier, licentiousness. Georgia, well before the Declaration of Independence has been declared, is already on a footing where they're heading towards that. Again, everything is contingent in these days, but he believes that his time in Georgia is limited.
So he has a sense that he's not going to be able to hold on to this, and the Britain will be able to hold on to Georgia.
And the Georgia Provisional Government and Council of Safety and such, and those early derivations of rebel power struggles by late fall, early winter of 1775. They have taken over the courts. They have taken over the militia. Wright is there without much power at all. He's not been molested yet in 1775. I mean, but he asks to return to London prior to 1776 because things are getting so desperate, and he is granted that return. But before he is able to do so, he is arrested in January of 1776.
Wow. And so then where is he sent when he is arrested?
Well, he's arrested. As I said, Joe Habersham, his best friend's son, approaches him at the government house in Savannah and says, "Sir James Wright, I place you under arrest." And they placed him under house arrest and forbade him from speaking with the British warships that were off the coast of Savannah, really trying to get some food and provisions. And within a month, he manages his escape in the cover of night. That he and his family, his daughters, make a several mile journey at night to escape to the British warships.
Wow, that's an exciting story.
It really is, and in fact, it involves the so-called Battle of the Rice Boats, as the rebels are trying to get to him before he is successfully and fully aboard the British warships in the harbor.
But they failed,
and that's where we believe all of his personal papers were destroyed. Was in that excursion.
Wow. So then he gets away, and then where does he go?
Well, they make their way up to Nova Scotia, as many ships did, and then sailed over to London. And from 1776 to 1779, he is in London, absolutely badgering anyone who would listen to him. George Germain was a constant correspondent and visitor. Someone that Wright visited, and George Germain just had enough of Wright. He was preoccupied for sure. He was stressed a great deal, and he just believed that Wright was not realistic enough. Wright kept imploring the ministry and Germain, just move some troops to the south, shift your strategy. And Wright provides all of these reasons for it. Provides some suggestions as to how it might be accomplished, and Germain consistently shuts him down. This is for 3 years, and he and Thomas Hutchinson are talking. Hutchinson said at one point, Hutchinson writes in his diary that Wright's ideas flowed freely from his mouth, indicating that Wright, he just spoke too much. He was very aggressive in his pursuit, and of course, he had 11 rice plantations, and at the time, 525 enslaved people that he left behind. So he had financial considerations at stake as well. And ultimately what happened is the British government and Germain activate the Southern Strategy, which indeed contains a lot of what Wright suggested. Even though Germain said that Wright was rather worthless in terms of kind of reviving a campaign in the South, but he does, and he ultimately sends Wright back to lead Georgia, even though throughout those 3 years, and even in 1778, after Georgia has been reconquered, if you will, in December of 1778 and January of 79, that Wright couldn't possibly return, but ultimately he sends Wright back and promises Wright that only your presence is needed to bring about pure peace and happiness in Georgia. And when Wright gets off the boat in Savannah in July of 79, he immediately realizes how far off Germain was.
Really?
And it's not as kosher as he was led to believe, even as he himself thought he might find. There was still a great deal of turmoil. He said that the rebels really held very strongly to their principles. And within several months, the French and the Continental Army under Benjamin Lincoln laid siege to Savannah. And that's kind of the beginning of the end. A very short return for Wright in terms of ability to maintain order and peace.
Right. So then he had been badgering Germain to send him back, and then Germain didn't think it would work. And then when the British do adapt the Southern strategy, he does go back, and then he sees that it's really a lost cause going back. That the rebellion had become something else by this point. And
yeah, the rebellion at this point has become a full civil war in Georgia. Vengeance upon vengeance, brother against brother, in the nature of every civil war. And he realizes that without a great deal of military support, Georgia would not be held. And within short order, after the successful defense of the siege of Savannah, in which the British and the Loyalists pushed the rebels and the French back into the Atlantic, if you will, the British decide to leave Georgia. And they head towards Charleston, and they successfully laid siege to Charleston in May of 1780. And Wright is arguing to anyone who will listen, commanders in America, ministers overseas, you have got to send some troops back here to protect us, because loyalists, he says, loyalists in Georgia maintain their loyalty at their own peril. And of course he was right. And by that time, it's difficult to ascertain whether the British even had the ability to send more troops. I mean, they were so spread out after the French joined the war effort, and then the Spanish, and so. But Wright is, as most people do, he's focused myopically on his own sector of the conflict, and he'll leave Georgia and he'll die very aggrieved about that.
Wow. And how long does he live after the war?
So he leaves Georgia for good, and America for good, in the summer of 1782. He spends the next 3 years of his life as the president of the Loyalist Commission, in which he is endeavoring to get compensation for Loyalist sufferers, including himself. And this is where I learn a good bit about him, because he unveils some things about his family and his personal story, and also he signs and writes hundreds and hundreds of affidavits for other fellow loyalists in really kind of, in many ways, very minute detail about who they were, what they did when they were in Georgia, what their reputation in terms of loyalty was, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, he receives, as one might expect, the largest loyalist claim in Georgia. 35,000 pounds is what he is awarded. Wow. Plus an annual annuity of 1,000 pounds. But he dies in that third year. So he dies in early 1786, and is buried and interred at Westminster.
Okay. He's not a young man at this time, too.
He's in his mid-60s now. His health had been rapidly declining in those last 3 years in London, as one might imagine. But yeah.
What a challenge it is to write a book about someone. There are a few papers, and I get a sense you look at them very objectively. That is, you're not writing the book about how James Wright could have saved the loyal America. Interesting character in this time.
Yeah, I tried to write a book that was objective, certainly, but was written from his perspective. He enslaved, as I said, hundreds and hundreds of people, and was very, very jealously guarded that property. James Habersham wrote that Wright did try to care for his slaves better than most, and historian Betty Wood, he was a tremendous historian of slavery in the colonial era, agreed that the evidence would suggest that, but it's still, he's still an enslaver, with everything that comes with that. But more than anything, I wanted to write a story from a loyalist perspective, not professing the loyalism is right or wrong, but just that perspective.
Explaining what they think. Did he know the people on the other side? I mean, he'd been in Georgia politics for so long, so the folks who are now the new leaders of Georgia must have been people he had known.
Yes, and these were people that were dear friends of his. Some who were had become political foes in the 1760s and 70s.
His best friend's son arrests him. So
His best friend's son arrests him. One of his best friends is a large planter and politician from South Carolina named Henry Lawrence.
Okay.
In fact, James Wright sends one of his sons to apprentice with Henry Lawrence, who was an incredibly successful merchant in Charleston, and they became. Well, Lawrence disowned James Wright very early on in the struggle in '75.
Mm-hmm. Well, this seems an appropriate time then to mention that your new project is writing about Henry Lawrence's son John, another fascinating character.
Well, I'm writing about Henry Lawrence himself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
His son John certainly will figure in it a great deal.
So Henry Lawrence is actually a major figure in this, and again, little known.
Yes, Henry Lawrence becomes president of the Continental Congress during the Valley Forge winter, and remains president of the Congress for over a year. In fact, they ask him to stay, but he doesn't want to. He ends up going to Amsterdam on a mission to obtain a financial deal with the Dutch, and he's caught at sea, arrested, and sent to the Tower of London for well over a year. And he'll be at the final peace negotiations between Britain and France at the end of the war. So I've got my hands full with him, and there is plenty of documentation. Just to my right over here, I've got 16 volumes of Henry Lawrence's papers.
That's much different than writing about James Wright, having someone who has a voluminous correspondence.
Yes, I was really excited about that until I realized now what I have to go through.
Yeah.
You got to go through all 16 volumes, right? So it may be information overload.
Yeah, good. That's great. So how far along are you with the Lawrence project?
I am probably halfway through. I've probably got another year and a half or 2 years of finishing up some research and then the writing itself. But I'm pretty deep into it.
Well, this is great. This is great. We're talking with Greg Brooking, who is a scholar, actually, of, I suppose, the Revolution, looking at it from different aspects, a biography of one of the leading loyalists and a biography you're writing of one of the leading patriots, one from Georgia and one from South Carolina, and also a full-time teacher in Georgia. So what perspective, this must be fascinating for your students to have someone who can give them primary documents from this period, which really helps to make it come to life.
Yeah, I hope they enjoy it. I mean, I certainly am enthusiastic when I talk about it. I teach primarily with primary source documents. I'll do some brief lectures, kind of providing some context and overview of each section as we move through American history. But I really like to engage them with the documents and then let them interact with them and kind of let that teach the content.
That's great. Anything else we should talk about, Greg? I know you have a life to get back to. We've really appreciated your time.
No,
You're muted again. I'm sorry. There we go. Nope.
How about now?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, I'm not sure what's happening, and I apologize, but I really appreciate the opportunity. As they might say, I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller. So I really love what you guys are doing with the project and the podcast, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Well, we're happy to have you with us, and happy to have your scholarship helping to illuminate the story of the American Revolution. So thank you so much for joining us. We've been talking with Greg. We're talking with Greg Brooking, who is a scholar of Georgia, and his book is From Empire to Revolution, Sir James Wright and the Price of Loyalty in Georgia. Now work on a biography of Henry Lawrence. And I want to thank you for joining us, Greg, and I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, the man behind the curtain, as well as our listeners around the country and around the world. And every week we thank folks who are tuning in regularly. And if you're in one of these places and want to connect with us, send Jonathan an email, jlane@revolution250.org, and he'll send you some of our Revolution 250 swag. And so this week I want to thank our friends in Dalton, Gainesville, Fort Valley, Stockbridge, Atlanta in the great state of Georgia, as well as folks here in the Bay State, in Dedham and Quincy and Hanover, and in Fairfax and Suffolk in Virginia, McKinney, Texas, Fort Worth, Binghamton, New York, Providence, Orlando, Chicago, and all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us. Now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.